Welcome to the Drowsy Historian, where nightmares from the past help you sleep better tonight. Tonight's journey, why it sucked to be a medieval monk during the Black Death. Chapter 1. The silence of the cloister turned to coughs. In the spring of 1348, the monastery at St. Albans smelled of beeswax, damp stone, and something far worse, something new. For centuries, the great abbey had been a haven of order, of silence, of prayers offered like clockwork. At sunrise, bells rang. At sext, they chanted. At compline, they slept. But in the spring of 1348, the silence began to change. First came the coughing, then the weeping, then the scratching of quills stopped entirely. Monasteries were supposed to be immune to chaos. Their thick walls and enclosed routines had survived war, famine, even heresy, but nothing could withstand what they could not see. The Black Death did not knock it, seeped through stone and script alike. It entered through a delivery of rye bread from the village, through a novice boy sent out to beg for oil, through rats hiding beneath the library steps, and once it entered, it began its quiet work. In most monasteries there were no physicians. That was a secular role. Monks relied on herbal knowledge, divine intervention, and strict routine, but none of those helped now. The monks of St. Albans had an infirmarian, Brother Cuthbert, who once treated sprains and scurvy with sage tea and prayer. He kept neat records of every cough, every pimple, every drop of blood. By May the parchment was full. Cuthbert noticed the pattern first, a sharp ache behind the eyes, a dry throat, and then within a day or two black swellings in the groin or under the arms, the bobos. He watched Brother Anselm vomit dark liquid that smelled like rotten onions, and then begin speaking nonsense. The angels are baking bread, he said, before dying hours later. The routine began to crumble. Morning mass was conducted by fewer and fewer voices. Meals in the refectory, once eaten in silence while one monk read aloud from the scriptures, became eerily quiet not from discipline, but from absence. They no longer had enough healthy monks to cook. The kitchen, once steaming with lentil porridge and pottage stew, was now quiet, except for the occasional sound of a spoon scraping an empty bowl. Interesting fact, monks were not isolated from the world as much as we imagine. Many abbeys owned large tracts of land, managed farms, breweries, even hospitals. They needed trade, they sent out servants, they received deliveries. That's how it got in, and once it did, monasteries became death chambers. Some abbeys reported death rates higher than the surrounding towns. Why? Because monks lived close together. They shared dormitories, refectories, chapels. They touched the same sacred items, crosses, relics, holy water fonts. They knelt side by side to receive communion, and many continued to do so long after the first deaths, believing it would protect them. But faith was no barrier. Not to this. In one chilling case recorded at the Cistercian monastery of Roche, nearly every monk perished within 6 weeks. The abbot buried the prior, then collapsed into the grave atop him. The last living brother, unable to toll the bell or conduct the mass, simply locked the gate and waited for death. Back at St. Albans, the novices began to falter. Novices, boys as young as 12, were not yet fully trained, but they were expected to follow the rules. Brother Thomas, only 14, was found weeping in the scriptorium. I touched him, he kept saying. I touched Brother Giles when he was coughing. He was forced into isolation. They placed him in a small stone cell beneath the cloister, gave him water and a psalter, and told him to pray. He was found dead 3 days later, clutching a bone-handled rosary and a sheet of vellum, half filled with ink. Here's a disturbing truth. Monks couldn't abandon their posts. Many believed leaving would damn them. They had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. That meant obedience unto death. If the abbot said stay, you stayed. If he said chant the litany of the saints over a room full of corpses, you did. And some, like Brother Aldred, sang the antiphons until his voice cracked from fever and he collapsed mid-syllable. Let's not forget the role of relics. Monks clung to holy relics during the plague, bones of saints, shreds of martyrs' robes, even splinters from what they claimed was the true cross. These were passed around during services, kissed and venerated. In hindsight, it's horrifying. They were touching the same object again and again, when no one understood germ theory. One relic shared among a dozen infected monks might have done more harm than good. The abbey's chronicles record another grim sight: rows of freshly dug graves in the cloister garden. Monks were buried in haste, often without proper rites. The smell of lime and rot replaced the aroma of incense. In one instance they ran out of burial robes and began wrapping bodies in old table linens. The bodies were stacked 2, even 3 deep in some plot. Brother Elwin, the monastery's gravedigger, kept digging until his hands bled. He died in the pit, still holding the shovel. You might think monks had comfort in death, at least they believed they were going to heaven. But even that comfort began to erode. As the bodies piled up, some began to whisper that this was punishment not from man but from God. They doubted. They feared they were being judged. Confession became frantic. Some monks tried self-flagellation, stripping to the waist and whipping themselves in the courtyard, hoping pain would cleanse sin. One novice was found unconscious from blood loss, whip still clutched in his hand. And yet they kept the rule, as much as they could. One monk, Brother Julian, continued to copy the Psalms every night by candlelight. His final entry, written in a shaky hand, read, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." He died 2 days later. His candle burned out at dawn. Even as the Black Death devoured the countryside, the monastery tried to maintain structure. That's the part most people miss. These weren't chaotic places. They were ordered, disciplined. The tragedy is in the slow collapse of that order. The silent scriptoriums, the empty pews, the bells that rang without anyone to hear them. And so, in the quiet stone cloisters of St. Albans, the coughing continued, and the silence returned, but this time, it was final. The silence wasn't the silence of prayer anymore. It was the kind that settled after a scream. Every morning fewer footsteps echoed through the cloister. The familiar scrape of sandals on flagstone, once the rhythm of monastic life, had thinned into scattered whispers. Barely a soul walked the halls. The few surviving monks at St. Albans Abbey clung to their routine not out of hope but habit, like men rowing a sinking boat long after the water reached their knees. By June 1348, over half the abbey's monks were dead. The rest no longer lived, they endured. Some refused to leave their cells, fearing that even walking past the scriptorium would invite the plague. Others burned incense constantly, hoping the perfumed air might purify the breath of death. But even the incense couldn't mask the smell anymore. That unmistakable stench of sweat, blood and rotting flesh, sour, warm and constant, followed them through every corridor. Here's something not often mentioned in sanitized textbooks. Monks weren't immune to fear. Yes, they had faith. But when your closest brother dies in the middle of prayer, eyes bulging, neck blackened with plague sores, belief starts to fray. The monastery had once been a fortress of stability, and now the most sacred rooms, like the chapter house and the oratory, echoed with hacking coughs and the occasional sound of someone vomiting blood into a basin. Historical records from the time, like the Chronica Majora, note that some monks began sleeping in the cemetery rather than the dormitory, hoping the open air would protect them from the bad humors thought to be trapped indoors. Brother Simon, a former scholar of medicine, even attempted to build his own crude plague mask by stuffing herbs into a linen cloth tied around his face. But it wasn't enough. He died gasping in the apothecary's shed, knocking over jars of honey and vinegar as he convulsed. Meanwhile, the rule of Saint Benedict, the sacred code all monks followed, began to bend. The rule required communal meals. Now food was left outside cells on chipped wooden trays. It required manual labor in the gardens. Now tools lay rusting in the dew. It required daily prayers for the dead, but when so many were dying each day, there weren't enough living left to pray for them all. Let's talk about food, because even survival came at a cost. Monks depended on lay brothers and village workers to manage fields, tend livestock and deliver essentials, but the villages had been gutted. With so many serfs dead or dying, fields went unplowed, animals roamed freely or died in barns. At St. Albans, they eventually slaughtered the abbey's prized milking cow, not out of ritual but starvation. The cook, Brother Alaric, who once prepared feasts for feast days, now boiled nettles with salted pig fat and called it supper. When that ran out, they ate bread made with ground acorns. And yes, it caused stomach pain, but hunger didn't wait for better options. A surprising fact, even during the plague, monks continued to write. Some chronicled the deaths with meticulous detail, like accountants of One entry from Westminster Abbey lists the dead by name, day and symptoms. Brother Marcus, June 9, groin swellings, blood from mouth, eyes red, died before Vespers. The ink is still legible today, but other writings were marginal notes scribbled between verses of psalms, pleas, warnings and confessions. One unknown monk wrote simply, "If I die, may this page save my soul." Brother Edmund, a once proud illuminator, had painted dozens of manuscripts with gold leaf and rich blues. Now he shook too violently to hold a quill. He tried once more to paint the face of Christ on a psalter, but the brush slipped, leaving a black smear across the halo. He wept for hours, not for his illness, but because, as he said, I have failed beauty, and beauty was fading everywhere. The once manicured cloister gardens now choked with weeds, roses untended, herbs gone wild, votive candles melted down to stubs, statues of saints darkened with smoke from hastily burned incense and funeral fires. Nothing gleamed anymore. Perhaps the most chilling sight came one stormy night when lightning split the sky and briefly lit up the great crucifix above the altar. There in that sudden glow, Brother Matthew saw what he thought was a figure kneeling, but when he approached it was a body slumped against the stone already cold. Outside the monastery the plague was worse. Inside it was concentrated. Every corridor, every bench, every prayer mat was reused, touched, coughed upon. The communal lavatorium where monks once washed in ritual became a place of infection. They stopped using it. Hygiene failed. The lice came, the rats multiplied, and yet some clung to their faith even harder. One monk, Brother Petronius, began writing a book of last hours, a prayer cycle meant for monks who knew they were dying. He stitched it together from scraps of vellum and fragments of old chants. He urged the others to repeat it in their final moments. He believed it might guide their souls faster to heaven. Of course he died before completing it. His fingers stiffened mid-line. The book still survives, unfinished. There's something poetic in that. Unfinished prayers, half-buried monks, rules half followed. A monastery built on structure now drowned in entropy. They were not heroes, these monks. They were not villains. They were just men, trapped in silence, waiting. And if you walked those cloisters today you'd still find their names scratched into wood panels. Hidden beneath the choir stalls, the echoes remain. You can almost hear it, the chant interrupted by a cough, the bell that rang for no one, the silence that never left.
Chapter 2. Prayer won't save you now. By the time the plague reached its second month within the monastery walls, faith began to mutate. The monks still prayed, of course, but their prayers had changed. They no longer asked for salvation. They begged for answers, for meaning. Some demanded an explanation from God. Others blamed themselves. But more and more began to wonder what good it did to kneel, to chant, to fast, if the black swellings still came and the deaths kept mounting. The truth is, monks were not strangers to suffering. Many had chosen the cloistered life precisely because it promised penance. Poverty, celibacy, and daily self-denial were part of the path to salvation. Pain was familiar, hunger was embraced, silence was sacred, but the Black Death brought a different kind of suffering, a chaotic, meaningless kind. It didn't test faith, it dismantled it. Brother Gervais, an elderly monk from Norwich, had prayed every dawn for 51 years. He fasted twice weekly, slept on a straw mat, and had not spoken a single idle word since he took his vows. When the plague came, he did as always, lit candles, recited the Psalms, and kissed the crucifix. Then one morning he was found convulsing in the chapel, frothing at the mouth. He died mid-prayer, face pressed into the flagstones. His death broke something in the abbey. You see, the monks had always been told that righteousness would protect them. Their lives were a fortress of virtue, and yet the sickness moved through them like wind through dry grass, fast, indiscriminate and cruel. When monks died faster than common thieves in the nearby village, a question took root. Had God turned his face away? Some began to pray more furiously. They held vigils for days, foregoing sleep. They lay prostrate in front of the altar for hours at a time. They sang the litany of saints until their throats bled. One group of brothers began a ritual of flagellation, stripping to the waist, walking barefoot around the cloister, whipping their backs raw with iron-tipped cords, chanting, Peccavimus, Peccavimus, we have sinned. Interesting fact, this wasn't isolated. Across Europe, flagellant movements broke out. Groups of holy men marched barefoot through towns, whipping themselves in public squares, believing physical pain could atone for the sins of mankind and halt the plague. Some monasteries embraced this, others condemned it as heresy. But at St. Albans, the brothers were desperate enough to try anything. Brother Aldwin, a soft-spoken man of 42, was the first to question things aloud. He had once been a lecturer in theology at Oxford before joining the monastery. He was respected, logical and deeply devout. One morning after Lauds, he stood in the chapel and asked a question that no one had dared voice. If the just perish with the wicked, what use is our righteousness? The room fell into silence, not the prayerful kind, the kind laced with fear. Later that night, he was found outside the cloister, barefoot and shivering. He had torn off his habit, claiming he was unworthy to wear it. God has abandoned us, he said over and over. We are dust. No, not even dust. We are refuse. He died 2 nights later, vomiting blood in the infirmary, refusing the last rites. His body was buried without ceremony, and he wasn't alone in his doubt. Brother Hugo began rewriting portions of the Psalms, quietly, carefully. In his personal psalter, he altered a verse from "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want" to "The Lord sleeps while the wolves devour." It was never found during his life. Only years later, after the plague had ended, did another monk discover it, hidden in the margins, like a whispered blasphemy. The tension between faith and horror was mirrored in daily routines. The monks still chanted the divine office, but their voices were hoarse and trembling. Some skipped services altogether. Confession became terrifying, not because of shame, but because it required closeness. The monk who confessed sins might be sick, the one who listened might be next. And the prayers themselves, so many prayers felt empty. The same verses repeated over the corpses of 5, then 10, then 50 dead. It was hard not to wonder, was anyone listening? One document from a Carthusian monastery in London reports that a group of monks began offering last rites in bulk. A grim line of plague-stricken brothers knelt before a single priest, who read prayers as quickly as possible, waving a crucifix like a man bailing water from a sinking ship. There was no time to anoint each one properly, no time to say personal farewells. Death moved faster than ritual. Meanwhile, relics, once the pride of monastic devotion, had become dangerous. At St. Albans, they possessed a sliver of St. Albans bone, locked in a jeweled reliquary. Pilgrims once came from across the kingdom to see it, but during the plague, the relic was moved frequently. Some feared it would attract the infected, others insisted it would save them. Eventually Brother Leofric took it into his cell and refused to let it go. He slept with it under his pillow, certain it would shield him. He died anyway. His body was found curled around the reliquary, like a child clinging to a toy. Let's not romanticize this. Monks were humans. They panicked. They clung to rituals not always out of piety but out of fear. Some confessed the same sin 10 times a day. Others said nothing at all, their silence thick with dread. Brother Ulrich stopped speaking entirely. He simply sat in the cloister garden, staring at the sky, mouth slightly open. He hadn't eaten in days. When asked what he was doing, he whispered, "Waiting for the angel." He died sitting upright. And then came the theological debates, fevered, whispered, desperate. Was the plague God's punishment? Was it the devil's work? Was it a test or a sentence? Had mankind failed? Had the church? Was this the end of days foretold in Revelation? Brother Adold, once a scriptorium supervisor, became convinced that the book of Daniel held the answer. He scribbled timelines in the margins, tried calculating divine wrath with lunar cycles. One surviving page reads, "The fourth beast is here. The mouth of death is open. We are its meat." Still, they kept praying. Not because they believed it would save them, but because they didn't know what else to do. It was all they had. The rhythm of the hours, the echo of Latin chants in stone corridors, the incense, the candles. Even when their faith cracked, their habits remained. And in that perhaps was the cruelest part. They did everything right, and died anyway. When the bells of St. Albans Abbey rang at Tess, their hollow clangs no longer summoned discipline or structure. They echoed like funeral chimes, signaling nothing but more loss. The surviving monks still tried to obey the rule, still rose from their pallets at the appointed hours, still recited prayers from cracked lips, but by midsummer even the sacred rhythm began to feel absurd. Prayer was no longer a calling, it was a compulsion, an instinct as lifeless as a dead man's twitch. Brother Oswin kept a careful log of each canonical hour, writing what was sung, who was present, and how many had been missing. His final entry read simply, "Matins, no voices, I sang alone." He died that night, his tongue blackened, psalter open on his chest. Outside the cloister, the world had already descended into madness. In towns and villages, people abandoned families, looted churches and hunted down scapegoats. Some whipped themselves in mobs. Others turned to sin, gambling and drinking in the shadow of death. But inside the monastery, the collapse was quieter, slower, less dramatic, a controlled ruin, like a cathedral eroding grain by grain. The monks didn't scream, they faded. Here's a detail often missed in history books. During the plague, monks still performed funerals. They had to. It was part of the rule and their sacred duty. But there came a point when the number of dead surpassed their ability to perform right. At St. Albans, they began burying 3, even 4 monks at once. The readings were shortened, the incense ran out, the psalms were murmured more than sung, voices hoarse and few. Brother Damien, the abbey's cantor, continued leading the funeral chants even as his own limbs began to tremble. His face grew grey, his steps unsteady, but he refused to stop. "I will sing for each of you," he said, "until I have no voice left." He kept his word. On the day he died, he dragged himself to the chapel and whispered the Sanctus over an empty pew. His body was found slumped against the organ. Monks, especially those in older communities, believed fervently in divine hierarchy. They followed rules with surgical precision: when to fast, when to bow, when to speak, when to remain silent. But the Black Death disrespected their order. It killed novices and abbots alike. It offered no pattern. Brother Walter, a robust man of 30 who fasted with enthusiasm and maintained the herb garden, dropped dead within hours. Brother Alphege, a 92-year-old who had gone blind and no longer left his cell, lived on for months, untouched. Was it divine judgment or randomness? That question tore at the heart of monastic identity. If God rewarded obedience and holiness, why were the faithful dying so painfully while sinners in the village sometimes recovered? The rule of Saint Benedict had taught them to see suffering as purification, but this suffering had no direction, no clarity. It was not the soul being refined, it was the body being broken. Monasteries once comforted others. During famine, they distributed food. During war, they offered shelter. But now the monks themselves were the afflicted, the pitiful, the ones needing mercy, and few came to help. Pilgrims stopped arriving. Villagers began avoiding the monastery altogether, afraid the holy men had become cursed. One chronicler from nearby Dunstable wrote, "The house of St. Albans is a house of ghosts. I saw no monks, only shadows. But what about the daily rituals, the hours? Did they continue? Yes, but distorted. The divine office, the structured prayer schedule that divided the day became an obsession. Some monks followed it more strictly than ever, believing precise adherence might save them. Others abandoned it, collapsing into sleep at odd hours, unable to distinguish prime from sext. One brother was found wandering the cloister barefoot at midnight, mumbling the wrong litany entirely. Still the church bells rang, even if no one came. This haunting detail comes from an abbey in York. The bell ringer, too weak to climb the tower, tied a rope to the clapper and pulled it from the chapel floor. For weeks he rang the hours alone, until one night the bell tolled off beat. The rope had gone slack, he had died holding it, and then came the dreams. Several monks wrote of visions. Some claimed they saw black-robed angels sweeping over the cloister. Others spoke of Saint Benedict weeping blood, or of Christ turning his back. Whether from fever, fasting, or sheer psychological strain, these hallucinations grew more frequent. Brother Ivo, a chronicler, wrote a chilling description. "In the night I saw a door in the sky, and it was closed. Beneath it stood the monastery rotting like fruit. I heard our chants rising upward, but they fell back to earth unanswered." Faith in those moments became not a comfort, but a torment. The monks had dedicated their entire lives to pleasing God, only to find themselves screaming into a void, and still they did not all break. One monk, Brother Basil, began rewriting the hours into shorter, simplified prayers. He called them words for the end. He recited them beside dying brothers, whispering into their ears when they could no longer respond. His most repeated phrase was, "Even if you do not hear, I will speak." It's that phrase that lingers, because it captures something essential about monastic resilience: not triumph, not clarity, just commit. In the absence of answers, in the face of death, they continued the only way they knew how, by repeating the liturgy, lighting the candles, kissing the cross. It wasn't faith in protection, it was faith in process. But even that couldn't last forever. In the final week of August, a silence fell over the abbey, not the silence of contemplation, but vacancy. The great hall was empty, the kitchens cold, the library dark. Of 73 monks, only 11 remained. They gathered in the chapel one last time according to one record. They sang the Te Deum, not with joy, not even with hope, but because that's what they were taught to do at the end of things. And when they finished, they blew out the candles.
Chapter 3. The scribe who buried his words. In the heart of every monastery, more sacred than the altar and older than the bells, was the scriptorium, the room of words. This was where the monks of St. Albans had preserved the Bible, the rule of St. Benedict, the commentaries of Augustine, and even the histories of kings and popes. But by the summer of 1348, the scriptorium had become a graveyard for ink, parchment, and memory. Not because the books were gone, but because the hands that copied them were. To be a scribe was a holy calling.
Monks believed copying the word of God was a form of worship. Each page was a prayer, each stroke of the quill a vow. Scribes worked in silence, hunched over desks from dawn until dusk, squinting by candlelight, and suffering stiff joints and failing eyesight in the name of preservation. Some worked months on a single psalter. Others spent years compiling a missal, embellishing it with gold leaf and lapis lazuli. Brother Cadfael had been a scribe for nearly 20 years. He was meticulous. His script was small, tight, and almost painfully perfect. He had been transcribing a complete Latin Bible since 1345, a task he believed would earn him salvation. By the time the plague arrived, he had finished Genesis through Psalms. He kept his tools arranged like relics: knife, stylus, pumice, ruler. But on June 12, Cadfael collapsed at his desk while copying Psalm 73. His final stroke trembled mid-letter. His fingers left a smudge on the vellum. The page still survives. Here's the historical tragedy. While towns burned and fields emptied, monks tried desperately to keep writing. Even as the plague emptied the refectory and blackened the dormitories, the few remaining scribes continued their work. Why? Because in their minds the world might fall, but the word must remain. Books were more than books. They were time capsules, lifeboats, silent prayers against oblivion. Brother Ainien, one of the youngest scribes, had just begun his apprenticeship. His hands were unsteady, and his Latin poor, but he practiced with scraps of worn parchment. When the plague began killing senior scribes, Ainien was ordered to step up. He was terrified. In one surviving fragment, he writes, "They say I must write the gospel now. I fear I shall write it badly, and no one shall be saved." He died before completing the book of Matthew. Let's talk about the tools they used, because they tell a deeper story. Vellum was scraped from calfskin, smoothed with pumice, stretched and cut into folios. Quills were sharpened from goose feathers. Ink was made from oak galls and iron salts. It took weeks just to prepare the materials. And yet, during the height of the plague, monks still attempted this labor, even as their hands shook with fever. One manuscript from Ely Abbey shows a sudden shift in handwriting halfway through a chapter, evidence that one scribe died, and another had to finish the page mid-sentence. That kind of interruption wasn't rare. At St. Albans, 2 scribes died in the same week, both working on different parts of the same antiphonary. The replacement, a novice named Brother Linnaeus, stitched the pages together using thread soaked in holy water. He believed it might protect the manuscript from contagion. The fear wasn't just for the body, it was for the loss of knowledge. Centuries of texts, biblical, medicinal, historical, were at risk. In many monasteries, when monks died, their personal notes, commentaries and marginalia died with them. Books left half-finished remained so. Glosses became riddles. Abbreviations, known only to their authors, became indecipherable. Some monastic libraries never recovered, and yet even amid decay, some scribes tried to record the plague itself. That's where our understanding of the Black Death largely comes from. Not noble records or royal decrees, but scribes who witnessed it firsthand and wrote with trembling hands what they saw. Brother Geraint kept a personal plague journal, hidden beneath his mattress. He documented who fell ill, what symptoms they had, and where they died. He described the color of buboes, the smell of the dying, and the prayers uttered by the desperate. In one chilling entry, he writes, "Brother Allen's eyes turned red, his breath smelled of almonds. He asked me if the sky was on fire. He died thrashing." But Geraint did more than record symptoms. He began speculating. He wondered if the disease came from bad air or from sin. He drew diagrams of wind direction. He tallied how many died on fasting days versus feast days. His journal is part science, part theology, part desperate poetry. It ends abruptly with, "I believe I am infected. If so, let this book testify that we tried. We tried." No monk ever found the journal during the plague. It was uncovered decades later, tucked behind a loose stone in the dormitory wall. This is the silent heartbreak of medieval monasticism. They died trying to understand, trying to record, trying to pass something on, and their fear of losing words extended to burial. When Brother Cellerwolf died, his fellow scribes buried him with his inkwell, not out of ceremony but because no one else wanted to touch it. It was believed to be cursed. Another monk, Brother John, insisted his psalter be placed on the altar during his burial. He believed it would speak for him at the gates of heaven. Meanwhile, the scriptorium itself grew quiet. The large windows once thrown open for light were now shuttered. The smell of ink was replaced by the smell of mold. Rats chewed through parchment bindings. Flies gathered on unfinished folios. And in the final days, one unknown monk, name lost to history, wrote a single line Latin verse on a loose sheet. It was placed face up on a scriptorium desk and left there after the monastery emptied. Scriptor scripsit, Deus tacuit, the scribe wrote, God was silent. The scriptorium, once the beating heart of intellectual devotion, was now a tomb of interrupted sentences. The long benches where monks once sat for hours copying sacred texts, now sat covered in dust, ink crusted in dried pots, half-cut quills brittle from neglect, and the silence, such a deep, aching silence, was worse than death itself. You see, silence was sacred in monastic life, but this was the wrong kind, not meditative, not purposeful. It was the silence of absence, of a world no longer speaking. Brother Etheric had once trained 3 junior scribes, teaching them how to shape each letter of the Unsal alphabet with balance and grace. He corrected spacing with gentle nods, showed them how to tilt the quill just so to avoid ink blotting, and made them memorize the Latin Psalms by heart. Now he sat alone in the far corner of the scriptorium, still copying Psalm 11:19, repeating the same line twice because his eyesight was failing and no one was left to correct him. Monks didn't just transcribe religious texts, they copied medical treatises, herbal remedies, agricultural notes, and even classical philosophy. Knowledge for them wasn't secular or sacred, it was survival. In the midst of the plague, many scribes turned to copying works like De Pestilentia, an old medical text from Salerno. They underlined lines about miasma, garlic poultices, and fumigation. They wrote marginal notes like tested on Brother Marcus, ineffective, or try rosemary and vinegar next, but none of it worked. The disease didn't care for inked words or centuries-old remedies. It devoured all the same. What's often forgotten is that scribes were not detached scholars, they were living, breathing men, weakened by cold, fasting, and overwork. Their hands were often blistered, their backs hunched, their stomachs empty. The act of writing for 12 hours a day on unheated stone floors left them vulnerable. They were not just victims of disease, they were already halfway there from exhaustion. Brother Willibald, one of the few monks with artistic talent, had been illuminating a book of hours, adding gold halos around the saints, painting roses in the corners of the pages, and coloring the sky with rare lapis blue. He worked on it for nearly a year. When the plague reached its peak, he begged to continue, saying he would rather die at his desk than in bed, and he did. He was found with his head resting on the image of Saint Michael, brush still in hand. The page beneath his cheek had warped slightly from his final breath. The fear of contamination crept even into this sacred space. One monk refused to use any vellum previously touched by a sick brother. Another insisted on sharpening his own quills, and never sharing ink pots. At one point they began leaving new supplies at the door to avoid face-to-face contact. Notes like ink mixed and new folios cut were scratched into the wood beside deliveries. And yet even in panic, the need to preserve knowledge persisted. A strange kind of defiance, really. The world was crumbling and the scribes answered by copying more, by writing harder, faster. Some pages bear the evidence: rushed script, inconsistent spacing, and blotches where the quill was dipped too fast. It wasn't elegance anymore, it was urgency. One scribe, identity unknown, began compiling a list of monastery rules that had been broken during the plague. He titled it Defectus Ordinis, Failures of Order. It included matins skipped on 17 occasions, meals taken without prayer, burial rites shortened or omitted, physical contact during confession, use of layman's remedies within sacred space, expressions of doubt written in personal psalters. He wasn't blaming, he was documenting, bearing witness. Even the breaking of rules, to him, deserved to be remembered. Meanwhile the books themselves suffered. Without proper care, parchment curled from humidity, ink faded, candle soot blackened the corners, insects chewed through bindings, rats made nests in the unused chests that once stored gospel books. One manuscript, recovered centuries later, had mouse droppings smeared across the Beatitudes, and yet miracles of survival did occur. A chronicle known as the Annales Sancti Albani continued, intermittently throughout the plague. Gaps of days, then weeks, mark where the scribe must have fallen ill or buried another brother, but it resumed. The handwriting changes at least 3 times, suggesting at least 3 monks took turns continuing the text. The final entry from 1349 reads, "We continue, though our number is halved and our voice is weak. God preserve these pages if not our flesh." Not all scribes lived to see the end, but some of their work did. The last functioning scriptorium table at St. Alban's was used by Brother Albric. He wasn't the most skilled scribe, nor the most devout, but he had a steady hand and a deep sense of duty. He began compiling obituaries, short entries for each monk who died, listing their name, their order of vows, and a single sentence about their life. Some read, "A kind brother who loved the Psalms." Others, He served the poor until his legs failed him. His final entry was for himself. Brother Alric made these records, hoped they would last. After his death, the scriptorium closed for over a year. When new novices arrived in 1350, they found books sealed in chests, parchment yellowed with mildew, and a note pinned to the wall with a rusted nail. The word is strong, even when we are weak. If you read this, remember us. That's what the scribes left behind. Not just books, but a record of their struggle to speak when the world stopped listening. They did not end the plague, they could not save themselves, but they wrote, and sometimes that is the most human thing of all.
Chapter 4. A meal of rotting lentils and dead rats. The rule of Saint Benedict commanded monks to live simply, to eat modestly, and to treat food not as pleasure, but necessity. In better times, the brothers of St. Alban's Abbey ate meals of pottage, lentils, black bread, and on feast days, the occasional bit of salted fish or cheese. Everything was measured, structured, and most importantly, communal. But when the Black Death came, it didn't just take lives, it starved the living. Hunger became its own kind of plague, gnawing from the inside out. The first sign wasn't empty bowls, it was silence in the kitchen. The abbey's cook, Brother Edric, was the first to fall sick in his wing. He collapsed beside the oven one morning, his ladle clattering to the flagstones. By week's end, 2 scullery monks and a gardener followed. The rhythm of chopping, stirring, and fire-stoking ceased. The kitchen fire, once blazing with the abbey's daily meals, flickered low, eventually extinguished altogether. With the cooking staff decimated, the monks tried to sustain themselves. Meals were no longer served in the refectory by the reader, who recited psalms. Instead, food was left on worn platters outside each cell. That is, when there was food at all. You have to understand that medieval monasteries weren't self-sustaining fortresses. They depended on networks, nearby peasants, tenant farmers, markets, and trade routes. When plague hit the countryside, those networks snapped. Villagers stopped coming, carts bearing grain rotted by the gate. In some cases, the drivers died en route and were found slumped over their horses. Without external supply, the abbey turned inward and downward. First, they consumed what was preserved: salted lentils, dried peas, garlic, pickled beets. Then they moved on to root vegetables stored in damp cellars, but the supply was neither endless nor fresh. By midsummer, the monks were boiling turnips that had already begun to rot, scraping blackened skins off with their fingernails. Brother Ked wrote in his journal, "We thank God even for spoiled things now, better mould than nothing." And then came the rats. Not just the plague-bearing kind, but the ones that nested in the granary, chewed through sacks of flour, and made homes in the hayloft. Desperate monks began setting traps, at first to protect the remaining food, then for the... There are confirmed cases from multiple abbeys, including Westminster and Peterborough, where starving monks roasted rats over low embers, skin crackling, bones crunching between their teeth. It was forbidden. It was also survival. The gruel they managed to cook, if at all, was often made with rainwater collected from the eaves, flavored with foraged nettles or bitter herbs. One recorded recipe includes crushed acorns, onion tops, and a spoonful of stale beer. That was dinner for a week. Monks began wasting away, not from plague, but from starvation. Their habits, once neatly belted, began to hang like curtains. Brother Matthew, once robust and jolly, was found too weak to walk. He crawled to the refectory and drank from a bucket of vinegar used for cleaning. He died 3 days later, his stomach torn apart. Now here's something grim. The rule of Saint Benedict discouraged speaking during meals. Silence was part of digestion and discipline. But during the famine, monks began talking desperate. Whispers of hunger, requests for more, debates over what might be edible. One novice tried chewing wax from old candle stubs. Another gnawed the bark of a willow tree in the courtyard. Brother Alwyn, the cellarer, had the grim task of managing what remained in the stores. His records began to shrink. 10 loaves, 3 jugs ale, until finally, a single line. Nothing. May God multiply it. When he realized no more food would come, he locked the cellar doors and threw the keys into the cloister well. The desperation began to erode rule. Monks stole from one another, quietly. Some hid bits of cheese under their robes. One was caught hoarding mouldy rye bread under his sleeping mat. He wept not from guilt, but because it had spoiled before he could eat it. By late August, the infirmary no longer held the sick, it held the starving. Thin as parchment, some monks lay motionless, eyes sunken, skin loose on their bones.
The plague was no longer the only killer. Hunger had joined the choir. The spiritual cost was immense. Fasting had always been a form of devotion, but now involuntary starvation made the holy act feel cruel. One monk cried out during prayer, "We do not fast for God, we fast because we must." He was silenced by the abbot, but others nodded in secret agreement. And yet even in this horror, rituals persisted. The refectory, though nearly empty, still held the rule. One monk continued reading aloud from the scriptures during the midday meal, even if no one was there to listen. His voice echoed off the stone walls, a ghost of obedience. Interesting fact, food wasn't just nutrition, it was liturgy. Certain meals marked feast days, certain ingredients signaled the liturgical calendar, but now, with scarcity, that calendar collapsed. One brother wrote, "Feast of the Assumption, meal, rat broth, Christ forgive us." Brother Lambert, the last able-bodied gardener, tried planting a quick crop of onions and leeks. He worked feverishly, hauling water from the well, whispering prayers into the soil, but his hands trembled from weakness. The crop never grew, the seeds were old. He was found lying face down in the garden, dirt in his mouth. By early September, only 7 monks remained with the strength to walk. Of them, only 3 could cook. They boiled scraps, bark, leaves. The broth they made was so thin it looked like cloudy water, but they still gave thanks before every sip. That's what's so haunting. Even as they starved, they prayed. Even as their stomachs twisted and their bones ached, they bowed their heads, not because they hoped for food, but because gratitude was all they had left. The days blurred into one another, marked not by the ringing of bells or the passage of the sun, but by the arrival, or more often, the absence of food. What remained of St. Alban's kitchen was now a hushed soot-dark corner, where 2 exhausted monks boiled whatever they could find. On one occasion, they stirred a thin porridge made from stale barley, and a fistful of dried mustard seeds. It burned at the bottom, and smelled of smoke and desperation. Still, it was devoured. In better times, meals had been silent, structured and sacred. The refectory was a solemn space. A reader would stand at a carved wooden pulpit, and recite passages from scripture while the others ate, heads bowed. Silence at the table was a reflection of spiritual discipline. But now, the refectory was empty. The benches were coated in dust. The lecterns stood crooked. Trays and bowls lay unwashed, stacked in a heap like forgotten relics of some long-past civilization. Monks ate in their cells, curled in corners, whispering prayers to accompany each mouthful of meager rations. A few turned their meals into private ritual. Brother Elric began drawing small crosses in ash on the walls before each bite. Brother Owen refused to eat unless he chanted 3 lines of the Psalms aloud, even if he was too weak to finish them. The acts weren't about nourishment, they were a way to hang on to identity, to routine, to humanity. But there were limits. One novice, just 16 years old, was caught stealing from the infirmary's herbal stores. He had mixed dried lavender with water to make a bitter drink he believed would soothe hunger pangs. The herbs had long since spoiled. He vomited for hours and died the next morning. His death was recorded as accidental ingestion, but everyone knew what it truly was, an act of starvation disguised as hope. Let's pause on the nature of that starvation. Starving doesn't look like the stories say. It isn't always skeletal frames and sunken eyes. Not at first. It begins with exhaustion, then apathy. Monks began skipping meals not by choice, but because they couldn't stand or didn't care. Fasting, once a holy act of discipline, was now indistinguishable from collapse. Brother Chian was found in the chapel, slumped against a pillar, his fingers clutching a spoonful of dried peas he never managed to eat. They were still in his hand when they buried him. In a cruel irony, the Black Death made fresh food dangerous. Bread left too long grew green and fuzzy. Water, when stored poorly, carried fevers. Monks boiled everything, even wine, even milk. They soaked moldy bread in vinegar to try to cleanse it. The vinegar burned their mouths. Still they drank. Brother Tobias, a former steward who once managed the abbey's accounts, had a habit of writing daily menus on small wooden slats. Barley stew with leeks, one read from April. Fish pottage and oat cakes, another from June. But by August his inscriptions became grim. Nothing. 1 rat, 2 dead doves found in garden. His final note, boiled shoe leather. May God forgive us. This was not unique to St. Albans. Across England and the continent, monasteries faced the same collapse of supply and sanctity. In some abbeys the dying begged not for prayer, but for meat. At Canterbury, a monk was excommunicated posthumously after it was discovered he had butchered and eaten a dog in the night. At Glastonbury, Rumours swirled that corpses had been exhumed for marrow. Did these things happen at St. Albans? No monk ever admitted it, but the garden behind the cloister was found decades later to contain shallow pits with animal bones that didn't match the monastery's livestock records. Rabbit, pigeon, and something disturbingly small and human-like. Some scholars suggest they may have buried malformed fetuses, or even plague-deformed infants left at the gate. Others whisper darker theories. Either way, they were buried quietly, without record, without prayer. And yet, in the midst of all this, there were glimmers of Brother Renaud, the abbey's beekeeper before the plague, left behind a curious record. When the fields emptied and crops died, the bees still produced honey, perhaps the only reliable food source left. The honey was hoarded and rationed. Renaud's journal lists which monks received a spoonful. Always the weakest, always the dying. It eases their final hour, he wrote. Something sweet before the darkness. He died in early September. His bees survived him. One cannot overstate the psychological toll of the famine. Food had once been part of community. Monks broke bread together, fasted together, gave alms together, but starvation isolated them, made them suspicious. Brother against brother. There were whispers that some monks hid food in their habits, that one or two escaped the abbey walls to beg from villagers. One never returned. Another returned with blood on his robes and refused to say why. Confession became a horror. The sins were no longer lust, pride or envy, but theft, hoarding, gluttony. Some monks wept in shame, others confessed joyfully, believing the end was near and that all sins would be purged soon anyway. The line between piety and madness thinned, and still they maintained dignity. When a monk died, no matter how emaciated, he was wrapped in a robe, his name whispered, a candle lit beside him, even if the burial was shallow, even if the prayers were mumbled. The act of acknowledging death with dignity remained sacred. Food may have failed, faith wavered, but ritual endured. In October, the abbot, now thin as a broomstick and barely able to stand, led the remaining 5 monks in a final shared meal. They boiled dried beans and wine into a bitter stew. No herbs, no salt, no oil. They sat together on the cold floor of the scriptorium, since the refectory was unusable. Before eating, the abbot recited from Psalm 22, "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies." Afterward, they sat in silence for hours, listening to the wind move through the cracked stained glass. That night, one of them died, and the stew went untouched the next day.
Chapter 5. The bell tolls for thee, and thee, and thee. In monasteries, bells were not just tools of time, they were voices of God. They rang for prayer, for meals, for mass, for silence. They summoned the living and honoured the dead. Each hour had its sound, each sound had its weight. But in the year of the plague, the bells at St. Albans rang more for the departed than the living. At first, solemnly, then constantly, then with desperation. The great bell suspended in the abbey tower above the cloister was nearly half a ton of forged bronze. When struck, it echoed over fields, through forests, across the nearby town like a rolling groan from heaven. It was rung to mark death, a single toll per soul. In the spring of 1348, that bell rang once a week. By summer, it tolled daily. By midsummer, it rang so often, the monks could no longer distinguish for whom it tolled. The tower trembled with the weight of mourning. The duty of bell ringer fell to Brother Roland, a stout man with wide shoulders and thick hands. He had never aspired to greatness, never held office, never copied sacred text, but he was dependable, honest, and he could pull the rope with the weight and rhythm needed to make the bell sing. He did it with reverence, often bowing before each ring. For him it wasn't just a task, it was a sacred farewell. At first, Roland recorded each name in a small leather-bound notebook. Brother Cuthbert, 8 June, 3 tolls. Novice Leo, 12 June, 1 toll. But as the deaths multiplied, the entries became sparse. 5 tolls, week of 17 July. Then too many, then nothing. His hands grew blistered. The skin of his palms split from gripping the coarse rope. He wrapped them in strips of linen, dipped in tallow, but the wounds reopened daily. Still he rang, sometimes with others watching, sometimes alone, sometimes not knowing if the person had died yet, but knowing they would soon. The rule said nothing about what to do when too many died at once. Monastic custom dictated 3 tolls for a professed monk, 2 for a novice, 1 for a servant. But in August, Roland rang 15 times in a single morning. By evening, he collapsed at the foot of the tower, not from plague, but exhaustion. Let's talk about sound. The bell was more than noise. It was communication. It told villagers a monk had died.
It reminded the brothers that life was fleeting. It was a sacred alarm, but the problem with constant death is that it numbs meaning. One toll stirred sorrow, a dozen bred dread, 100 became background. Brother Felix, a young monk with a poetic spirit, wrote in his psalter, "The bell tolls and tolls, no longer a mourning, but a mocking. It calls us to prayer, but we only listen for our own name." And they did. Every monk feared the sound would someday ring for him, and some began to imagine it. Phantom tolls heard at night, even when the bell was still. Fevered monks cried out, "Did you hear it? Did it toll for me?" One novice confessed to having dreamt of a procession of bells with no ropes, ringing themselves as they floated above the abbey like harbingers. Brother Roland tried to keep the ritual clean. After each toll, he knelt and whispered the name of the deceased, even if no one was watching. But toward the end of August, he stopped kneeling, he stopped whispering, he simply rang. And when he rang, he cried, not loudly but steadily, the tears tracing down cheeks streaked with dust from the tower's beams. There's an eerie detail in the records. The pitch of the bell began to change. The constant use, the force of repetition, the worn rope, the loosening fixtures, all caused the sound to warp. It deepened, slowed, became less clear. Villagers said it no longer sounded like a bell. One said it sounded like a groan from beneath the earth. Another said it was as if the stone itself were mourning. And it wasn't just the great bell. Smaller handbells, used during processions and funerals, fell into disuse. Their ring was seen as an omen. When one cracked during a burial, Brother Alwyn refused to ever ring it again. "The bell is broken," he said. "So too is the order of things." Funeral customs decayed in tandem. The monks were supposed to ring the bell during the procession to the grave, during the final commendation, and after burial. But with fewer hands and more corpses, the rites became abbreviated. A single toll, a wordless burial, silence, then back to the dormitory, to wait for the next. It's worth noting that bell ringing itself could be deadly. The tower was narrow, the climb was steep, the dust was thick. Roland inhaled it daily. His hands bled, his back ached, and yet he climbed, until one morning in September. He didn't come down. They found him slumped beside the rope, head resting against the wooden beam. His notebook sat open in his lap. The final page was blank. After Roland's death, no one volunteered. The bell was silent for 3 days. It was the longest silence since June. Then Brother Cedric, though barely able to walk, dragged himself up the tower steps. He rang once, then twice, then fainted. His tolls were uneven, and one cracked a window in the chapel. No one rang it again for a week. That silence was louder than sound. In monasteries, bells had always been the frame of life. Now they marked its collapse. The villagers who once measured time by their sound now avoided the abbey entirely. "No one wants to hear death's clock," one chronicler wrote, "and yet it chimes." After Brother Roland's death, the tower bell no longer rang with rhythm or reverence. What had once been a sacred signal of transition, birth to life, life to death, death to God, was now a grim echo of fatigue and disarray. The surviving monks at St. Albans debated whether to continue ringing it at all. Was it still a rite, or had it become an admission of failure? The abbot insisted it must continue. "We ring not for the dead," he said, "but for the living, that we may not forget how thin the veil has become." So they drew up a new rota, assigning the remaining strongest to the task. But no one was truly strong anymore. Most had fevers or wounds or lungs too tight with plague to climb stairs. Some stood at the bottom of the tower and pulled with all the strength they had left, the sound barely carrying beyond the cloister. In desperation, Brother Lucan fashioned a crude pulley system to assist the tolling. He tied ropes across the beams and attached them to the bell's clapper, anchoring them to the floor so that one monk could trigger it with his foot. It worked barely. The bell began to clank instead of ring. It stuttered, missed beats, echoed strangely, but it was sound, and that mattered. There's something haunting in how stubbornly the monks clung to that bell. When food was gone, when books remained half-written, when even the liturgical hours blurred into exhaustion, the tolling persisted. It became a heartbeat, weak but unwilling to stop. Outside the abbey walls, villagers mistook its new pattern for prophecy. Some believed the tone of the bell predicted who would die next. If it rang slow, it meant a peaceful death. If it rang shrill and rapid, a violent one. These were superstitions, of course, but who among them wasn't looking for meaning? One curious account from the abbey's later records describes a boy no older than 12, who stood outside the gate for 3 consecutive days, listening to the bell. When a monk finally approached him, he said, "I want to hear when it rings for my father." The boy had come from the nearby village of Sopwell. His father had been a carpenter who worked on the abbey roof. He'd fallen sick weeks earlier, and the boy had heard that monks rang for everyone, even peasants who'd once stepped inside. The monk said nothing. He didn't know how to tell the boy that they had stopped tolling for outsiders weeks ago. The bell now rang only for monks, and not even all of Brother Everard, a gentle man known for tending the sick, died in the infirmary, while trying to cleanse another brother's wounds. His death went unnoticed for nearly a day. By the time someone realized he was gone, the record of his passing was scribbled hastily in the margins of the choir book. Everard gone to rest. No toll. No one had the strength to climb the tower. No one had the voice to speak his name aloud. This omission was not unique. A growing number of monks were buried without ceremony, without candles, without procession, without bells. Their names passed into memory like smoke into winter air, thin, cold, gone. Brother Felix, who had once described the bell as God's echo, began to have nightmares. In his sleep he screamed about bells that rang by themselves, bells that called names not yet dead. He grew convinced that the bell had become a curse. "We toll and we summon it," he said, eyes wide. "We call it to us." His health declined rapidly, and he stopped speaking altogether. When he died, they buried him silently, in the rain. Interestingly, the sound of the bell seemed to live on in the minds of the monks long after it stopped ringing. In their fevered dreams, they described hearing it tolling in reverse, the sound being swallowed back into silence. Brother Gideon wrote, "It now tolls inside us." The bell became metaphor, not a call to prayer, but a reminder that death was now ordinary, that the extraordinary ritual of farewell had become a mundane occurrence. Once every monk received 3 tolls, then 2, then 1, then none, and yet some clung to the tradition in defiant ways. Brother Thomas, who had avoided illness through sheer isolation, began tolling a handbell at night from his cell window. Just one ring, precisely at midnight. No one asked why. No one told him to stop. It continued for 12 nights. On the 13th there was no sound. His cell was found empty. He had walked out into the woods alone. They never found his body. Such stories became legend. In the decades after the plague, younger monks spoke of the ghost bell of St. Albert. Some claimed to hear it ring on stormy nights. Others said that if it tolled in a dream, it meant your soul would leave your body before dawn. These were myths, surely, but myths often carry truth in a different tongue. What we do know is that the great bell fell silent for good in October 30. Its rope frayed beyond repair. The pulley snapped. The tower began to show signs of stress. No one had the strength or skill to fix it. It remained still for months, swaying only in the wind. A mute relic, a shell of what it had. When repairs were attempted years later, after the plague had passed, the workers found something lodged in the rafters, a folded scrap of parchment, tied with twine, stuffed between 2 beams. It read simply, "If these walls still stand, remember us. If this bell ever tolls again, let it ring for those who had no one to ring for them." It wasn't signed, but many believe it was written by Brother Roland before his death. Others say it was Brother Felix clinging to poetry in his final days. It doesn't matter who wrote it. The bell, like the monastery, like the monks, bore witness. It rang and rang until silence was all that remained.
Chapter 6. When confession becomes a death sentence. Before the plague, confession had been a ritual of purification, a moment of quiet surrender between a soul and its maker. Monks took it seriously, as they did every aspect of their rule. Each sin, whether spoken aloud or harboured in silence, was a weight on the soul, and so they confessed regularly, in whispered tones, behind cloistered walls, believing that through honesty and penance, they could step closer to salvation. But during the Black Death, confession turned into something else, something darker, something deadly. The confessional was no longer a place of safety, it became a place of risk, and in some cases the very cause of death. The disease which passed through breath, touch and closeness now stalked the very act that was meant to cleanse. Every whispered secret could carry a curse. Every act of spiritual mercy could become a fatal mistake. Brother Aldrich was the abbey's confessor, a lean, serious man in his 60s. He had heard more sins than he could remember. Envy, lust, doubt, pride. He rarely passed judgment, only assigned penance and offered absolution. His presence was calming. Monks trusted him, but by the end of June his hands had begun to shake. He confessed it to no one. Not because he feared death, but because he feared being unable to serve. He was still hearing confessions daily when the blisters formed on his neck. It's easy to imagine medieval confession as formal and removed, but it wasn't always so. In monasteries the confessor would sit close, often beside or across from the brother, listening without interruption. There was no screen, no barrier. The connection was meant to be personal, human, holy.
And in a world where the plague's cause was unknown, that closeness became a death sentence. Brother Simon was the first to die after confessing to Aldrich. He had wept during the confession, grief-stricken over a stolen candle of all things, and then 2 days later was vomiting blood in the infirmary. Aldrich, despite fever and fatigue, insisted on attending him again. When Simon died, Aldrich administered the last rites and returned to the chapel with shaking knees. He knew then what was happening. Confession wasn't just dangerous, it was a channel. He had become a bridge between the dying and the living, a conduit of both mercy and pestilence. Still, he continued. Why? Because he believed in the power of absolution, because he feared what would happen if a brother died unshriven, because the rule of Saint Benedict demanded obedience to death, because some part of him needed to believe that the plague didn't mean God had stopped listening. Let's pause to reflect on the logic of the time. The monks didn't understand contagion. Germ theory was centuries away, but they understood pattern. They saw that the closer you came to the sick, the more likely you were to fall ill, and the confessor came closest of all. He heard every final breath, held every trembling hand, sometimes even embraced the sobbing monk as he collapsed beneath the weight of his sins. By August, Aldrich was coughing blood. He refused to stop. Other monks tried to take up the role, but few had his resolve. Brother Geoffrey lasted a week before collapsing mid-confession. Novice Matthew, just 17, tried once and then spent the next 2 nights in terror that he had inhaled the disease. He began reciting the Lord's Prayer every 5 minutes, eventually falling into a catatonic silence. He never spoke again, so monks began to confess from doorways, from across the corridor, whispering through cracked doors, scratching words into slates and holding them up with trembling hands. Some took to writing their confessions out completely, lengthy scrolls of sin and sorrow which they slid under the abbot's door like sick letters. One scroll found decades later read, "I coveted Brother Tobias's cloak. I drank wine before Vespers. I doubted that God sees us now. I doubted everything. Please, I cannot bear to die with this inside me." The abbot, already weakened by fever, could not read every scroll. But his eyes blurred, his hands trembled. He burned some, buried others. He hoped God could read between the lines. And this raises a haunting question. What happens when the last confessor dies? When Aldrich finally collapsed mid-rite with oil still on his fingers, there was no one left qualified to replace him. He was buried in a hastily dug grave near the cloister wall, without confession, without absolution, without even his own final words heard. The man who had emptied every soul but his own was silenced. Panic spread. Confession was more than ritual, it was a guarantee, an assurance that the soul would not be lost. To die without confession was unthinkable. Monks began confessing to each other, brother to brother. Some begged novices to listen, others stood before the altar and shouted their sins aloud, weeping openly. In a community that prized humility, this was unprecedented, but fear outweighed shame. There are even accounts of monks confessing to inanimate objects, to statues of saints, to crucifixes, to the walls of the scriptorium. One brother stood before the bell tower, placed his hand on the cold stone and whispered everything he had ever regretted. "If I am alone," he said, "then let these walls carry my burden." Still, the anxiety deepened. Brother Linus, gaunt and sleep-deprived, attempted a heretical workaround. He wrote a universal confession and made copies of it. Placing one under each sick monk's pillow, it read, "I have sinned, I have erred, I repent, forgive me." He believed if they died with the scroll close it would count. No one stopped him, no one knew what else to do. These were desperate men in a time when structure had failed. The confession booth had turned into a vector of death. The sacred closeness between two souls had become a risk no one could afford. Yet still they confessed, in fragments, in whispers, in fear, because if God was still watching they wanted to be seen. After Brother Aldrich's death, the abbey changed, not in structure. It was still the same cold stone and shadowed halls, but in sound. The rhythm of whispered sins, of Latin absolutions and muttered penance, had disappeared, and what replaced it wasn't silence, it was noise, crying, coughing, incoherent prayer. The sacred balance between sin and forgiveness had cracked, and what leaked through was fear. For centuries, confession had been the cornerstone of monastic life, not just before death but as a routine, daily, weekly. Depending on the house, it was a way to cleanse the soul, to keep the mind free from pride or temptation. Monks confessed everything, sleeping too long, eating too quickly, doubting God for even a moment. The act was humbling, it reinforced discipline, it was personal accountability elevated to divine but now in the shadow of the plague it became a A scramble, a confession not of conscience but survival. Brothers begged to speak before their symptoms worsened. They lined up those who could still stand outside the abbot's cell, each hoping to be but there was no confessor, just a hollow room and a sick man, eyes glazed with fever, barely able to lift a hand in blessing. What does a monk do when he has no one left to confess to? Some gave up. They rationalized their sins, telling themselves God would understand. Others tried speaking directly to the sky. One climbed onto the roof during matins and shouted his confession toward the stars. He was found shivering in the rain the next morning, his tongue swollen, his voice gone. Brother Hugo, a former illuminator who had abandoned his desk when the plague arrived, began carving his confession into a wooden beam in the scriptorium. Each day, a new line. I failed to help Brother Simon. I envied Brother Cuthbert's steadiness. I lied about how sick I felt. He carved until his hands bled. He died with his final words, unfissioned. I feared. The fear of dying unshriven weighed more heavily than the disease itself. It was not the fever or the blackened buboes that terrified the monks, it was the thought of entering death's door with sins unspoken. The fear that the plague was not just a test of faith but a judgment, and without confession, they were damned. Let's look at what historical records tell us. Monks across Europe responded similarly. At Westminster, sick monks were encouraged to shout their confessions from their beds, while others listened from the hallway. At York, they began using chalk to write sins on slates, which were then wiped clean by the abbot's assistant, symbolizing absolution. But at smaller houses like St. Albans, innovation was limited by manpower. The dying often died alone, with secrets. Some monks turned inward. They became obsessed with memory. One, Brother Damasus, wrote a catalogue of his own faults every day for a month, believing if he could list everything before the end, God would recognize the effort. He died with a page still clenched in his hand. His last line read, I remembered everything but love. Others, unable to find a living ear, began to confess to the dead. This was not as strange as it sounds. In their desperation, monks believed that if the soul of a righteous brother had already passed into heaven, perhaps he could intercede, perhaps he could carry a confession up with him. So monks whispered into graves. They sat beside fresh dirt and poured out their regrets. One monk even left notes under rocks on several graves, folded tightly, like tiny letters to saints. What became of these acts? Were they madness, faith, both? Perhaps the most tragic story is that of Brother Eberwin, a quiet monk, often overlooked. He had once served as assistant to the infirmarian. When the plague arrived, he tried to care for others until he grew weak himself. Knowing he had no one left to confess to, he locked himself in the library. Surrounded by books of psalms and penitence, he lit every candle he could find. He recited every psalm of repentance from memory. Then he lay down on the stone floor and waited. He died alone, but with the words, "Have mercy on me, O God," still echoing in the air. Confession had always been private. Now it became public. Some monks in their final moments shouted their sins aloud in corridors, weeping, not for what they had done but for the ears that could no longer hear them. The air grew thick with grief. Not just for lost lives but for lost chances, lost rituals, lost meaning. Because what is confession without another to receive it? And still some monks resisted despair. Brother Theobald, one of the few still lucid by October, began recording collective confessions. He gathered words from dying brothers, wrote them down and swore he would bring them to the altar once the plague passed. His scrolls included sins of lust, pride, cruelty and abandonment. He wrapped each one in linen, sealed them with wax and placed them in a chest beside the chapel. His last scroll, written in a shaky hand, read, "For all I forgot to say, he died before the plague ended." Chest was found decades later, hidden behind the organ. We must remember that confession is not just a matter of faith, it's a matter of, it requires someone to speak and someone to listen. In St. Albans, both were in short supply. So the monks did what they always did when the rule failed them. They adapted. They confessed to walls, to saints, to the air, to graves. They carved their sins into wood and scratched them into stone. They wrote them in margins, whispered them into cloth, hummed them into silence, because even if God no longer answered, they still believed it mattered to be heard.
Chapter 7. Burning Books and Burning Bodies. By October, the monastery at St. Albans no longer smelled of incense and beeswax. The air had changed. It stung with smoke. It hung heavy with the sour scent of rot, sweat, and something far worse, burning parchment and burning flesh. The fires that once warmed the scriptorium were now lit for destruction, not comfort. Books and bodies both went into the flames. Burning had become necessity. The monks didn't start by burning books. That came later.
First came the bodies. As death outpaced burial, as the graveyard filled, and the earth grew shallow, the monks turned to fire, not out of cruelty or heresy, but survival. The plague left behind too many corpses, too fast, too contagious. Some were too decomposed to move, others had burst open in their beds. The decision was made. They must burn. Brother Rabin, the former gravedigger, lit the first pyre in the south cloister yard. He used broken carts and old hymn benches for fuel. The bodies were wrapped in linens, sprinkled with lime, and laid one by one upon the heap. Then the torch. The fire cracked and hissed. Some monks knelt and prayed, others turned their eyes away. The smoke blackened the air. Bits of burnt hair and cloth drifted onto the stones like ash snow. It wasn't just the abbey. Across Europe, cremation, long considered taboo, suddenly re-emerged. The church had condemned it for centuries, believing only buried bodies could rise again on Judgment Day. But desperation overrode dogma. The flames were faster than shovels. At St. Albans, the fire became routine. Monks brought bodies in carts, sometimes 3 at once. They stopped saying names. They stopped praying over each one. The Lord knows them, Brother Justus said. We no longer have to. But the question remained. If you die without a proper burial, without rites, without even a name on the lips of the living, have you really been remembered? Let's talk about the books. They were not burned all at once. At first it was by accident. A candle knocked over in the infirmary caught the corner of a manuscript. It was only a copy of the rule, easily replaced, but the scent of burning vellum lingered. Then came the fear. Brother Ulrich claimed the books were infected, that the plague clung to their pages. The word has become a vessel, he said. We must cleanse it. He argued that texts handled by the dying were unsafe, especially the psalters passed from bed to bed. Some monks agreed, others called it sacrilege. The abbot hesitated, until Brother Osric, who had been copying a prayer book for the dead, died with his face pressed into the parchment. The book was placed in the fire the next morning. After that, the threshold lowered. Any manuscript touched by a sick monk was not just psalters but herbals, missals, hagiographies, even the Book of Hours, books that had taken years to create, books illuminated with care and colored with rare dyes, gone in minutes, and still it made them feel safe. They began sorting the library into piles, clean and unclean. It didn't matter that they had no evidence. It was about control. Fire gave them the illusion that anything was in their power. Brother Cassian wept as he placed his own bestiary into the fire. I drew each bird with love, he said, but love carries nothing now. The flames consumed not just knowledge, but memory. Within those pages were genealogies, histories, marginalia records of who they had been, what they had done, what they had believed. Some monks resisted. Brother Aldwin hid a psalter beneath the floorboards of the scriptorium. Brother Thomas buried a copy of St. Benedict's rule behind the chapel, but many more simply obeyed. Because when bodies burn, books seem easier. Soon the distinction between sacred and profane vanished. A hymn book and a blanket were thrown into the same fire. A Bible and a pair of sandals. What mattered was that they belonged to the dead. One monk, desperate, not to destroy his own work, tore pages from a manuscript and used them to wrap bread. The word will feed us still, he said, half laughing. He died 2 days later. Interestingly, despite the burning, they kept writing. Even as their library shrank, some monks clung to the act of recording. They used scraps, margins, whatever wasn't yet tainted. They wrote in corners, in closets, behind altar cloths. One surviving scrap, written in charcoal on a fragment of parchment, reads, "We burn what we love, because it frightens us. May God forgive the fires." Brother Lucius, perhaps the last functional scribe, began copying parts of Ecclesiastes with ink made from ash. He wrote, "Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh." And below it, "We are weary now, so weary." What the monks could not write, they memorized. They repeated psalms aloud to each other at night, chanting them into the darkness like lullabies. Some tried to preserve verses through chant, hoping the sound might outlast the paper. "If the plague takes our eyes," said one monk, "may it not take our voices." But the burning continued. By late October, the pyres no longer shocked. The smell had become part of the air. New monks did not bother asking what was being burned. They already knew. Fire had become the monastery's final language, a flickering prayer, a terrible devouring hymn. By the time the first frost crept across the cloister stones, the pyres at St. Albans were a constant presence, crackling through the night, casting flickering shadows against the chapel walls. The monks had grown used to the smoke. It curled through the scriptorium windows, and drifted down the refectory halls like incense gone sour. Some said it smelled of purification, others said it reeked of guilt. Burning had become a ritual of erasure, of necessity, yes, but also of no one could say exactly how the plague spread, but many believed it clung to things: clothes, bedding, books, walls. One monk claimed he had fallen ill simply by touching the sandals of a dead brother. Another refused to enter his own cell after a sick novice coughed near the door. Fire then became the only answer. It didn't discriminate, it destroyed. The bodies went first, then the books, then slowly, everything else. By late October, the monasteries archived scrolls of lineage, birth registers, donation records. Land grants had been reduced to ash. Some had survived for centuries, their seals still intact, their Latin still sharp, but they were contaminated, so they burned. One charter from the reign of Henry III, detailing the abbey's rights to grazing land, was hurled into the fire by Brother Coleman with trembling hands. "We no longer need cows," he said. "We barely need grass." The heat from the fires warped nearby stone. The courtyard well, once clear and cold, now reflected red. Birds stopped landing on the cloister roof. Even the rats began to vanish, and the monks, they shrank into themselves. They became shadows, their habits hung loose, their eyes glassy, their movements slow. Firelight flickered against their faces as they worked, stacking, lifting, pushing, praying. The abbot, who had once forbidden even the lighting of unnecessary candles on feast days, now stood silently before the flames, watching as the abbey's memory burned. Not everyone accepted. Brother Edmund, a quiet man with an enormous love for old texts, tried to hide what remained of the monastery's herbarium. It was an ancient volume, filled with careful illustrations of plants and notes in Old English, Latin, and even Greek. He believed it held wisdom they might need when the plague passed. He begged the others not to destroy it. "We must leave something behind," he whispered. "We must." They found the herbarium hidden beneath his sleeping mat. After he died, it was burned the next morning. Not all burnings were deliberate. A fire, meant only for cleansing robes, spread into the vestry. In moments, centuries-old altar cloths and handwritten missals went up in smoke. No one tried to save them. The monks just watched, motionless, as the gold thread curled and blackened. It was as if effort itself had become heretical. And then came the night of the great scriptorium fire. It began with a fallen candle, knocked from a bench by a dying monk's convulsion. The flames spread quickly, licking the shelves, dancing up the vellum spines. No one fought it. They stood outside the doorway, listening to the crackle of knowledge lost. Bedia, Augustine, Gregory, Boethia, wisdom, gone in moments. Brother Petrus wept openly. "We were meant to preserve," he said. "Now we erase." But for others there was comfort in the fire. Fire cleansed, fire simplified. A monastery built on memory was now a monastery of forgetting. And forgetting, in those days, felt merciful. Interesting detail, despite the burnings, some monks still tried to preserve something of the abbey's soul. They carved psalms into the wood of the pews, scratched Latin verses into the stone floor with bits of bone or iron. They recited histories aloud at night, repeating the abbey's founding legend in chant. "We were raised on prayer stone by stone, for the glory of God." They said it over and over, until it felt more like a lullaby than a fact. But memory cannot live on breath alone. By November, what remained of the abbey's books were locked away in a cold, damp chamber beneath the altar. A dozen volumes, the ones least touched, least suspected. They were wrapped in cloth and sealed in a chest of oak, smeared with holy oil. Brother Antonius called it the Ark. "Let the next generation open it," he said, "if there is one." And then one day, the fires not by choice but because there was nothing left to burn. The bodies had been cremated, the blankets scorched, the books mostly ash, the wood stores gone, only stone remained, and the monks themselves. One monk wrote on the wall of the infirmary, with a shard of charcoal, "Now that the books are gone, we carry the words within. Now that the bards are gone, we carry their names. Now that the abbey is silent, we speak only to remember." It is unclear who wrote, but it remained preserved in the cracks of the stone, long after the plague passed. Centuries later, when visitors came to St. Albans, they found remnants: scorched walls, warped metal, burned altarpieces. They found a stone shelf blackened by fire, and tucked behind it, a small piece of vellum untouched by flame. On it, written in faded ink, "We burned what we could not bury, we buried what we could not save, and what we could not burn or bury, we spoke aloud to God." A final testimony, not to victory, but to endurance.
Chapter 8. The Novice Who Tried to Escape. The vow of stability was one of the cornerstones of monastic life. When a monk entered a monastery, he promised to remain there until death. He surrendered his will to the rule, his movements to obedience, and his future to the cloister. For the elder brothers of St. Albans, this vow had been etched into the marrow of their bones. But for the novices, boys barely into adolescence, barely understanding the prayers they recited, it was different. They were still tethered to the outside world by memory, by longing, by fear. And when death filled every corridor, that tether pulled hard. Novice Benedict was 16. He had arrived at St. Albans just 1 year before the plague came. The son of a brewer, he had been handed over by his mother with a whispered prayer and a crust of bread, placed in the abbot's care as an offering for his family's sins. His eyes were too wide, his hands too soft. He walked like a boy forced to play at being a man. When the sickness began, Benedict did as the others did. He scrubbed chamber pots, he lit the altar candles, he helped carry trays to the sick, keeping his head bowed, whispering psalms under his breath. But by midsummer, after watching 3 of his teachers die, each more violently than the last, something shifted in him. He stopped eating, he stopped praying, he stood at the edge of the cloister at dusk, staring through the iron gate at the fields beyond. Other monks noticed. "He's thinking of leaving," Brother Anselm muttered. "He'll damn himself." To flee the monastery was unthinkable. It wasn't just disobedience, it was treason against God. The world outside was filth, corruption, temptation. The abbey was salvation. That's what they had always been taught. But what if salvation meant dying alone in a cold cell, coughing blood, with no one to hear your final words? Benedict didn't leave right away. First he tested the gate, he touched the lock, he watched the sky, he asked questions no novice should. "Do you think there are places the plague hasn't touched? If we had left earlier, would we be alive? Would God punish someone who only wanted to live?" Brother Marcus, a teacher known for his gentleness, tried to soothe him. "We are already in the safest place we can be," he said. "Even if death comes, it finds us in prayer, in peace." Benedict didn't answer. He was watching a bird that had landed on the cloister wall, its wings twitching, its eyes alert. When it flew away, he followed it with his gaze long after it had vanished. And then, one morning, he was gone. The brothers noticed his absence during Lauds. His bed was empty, his sandals gone. The gate, still locked from within, showed no signs of tampering. But near the south wall, beneath a crumbling section of mortar, they found footprints. One of the stones had been loosened, just enough. The abbey fell into turmoil. The abbot, weakened by fever but still conscious, declared that no one was to speak of the escape. "His soul is his own now," he said. "We must pray he finds peace, or forgiveness." But the monks whispered anyway. Some called Benedict a coward, others called him wise. A few wondered aloud if they should have followed. Let's pause on what this act meant. To run from the monastery wasn't just dangerous, it was illegal. Monks were registered under church authority. To abandon your post, especially during a time of divine judgment, was to forfeit salvation. If caught, Benedict could be whipped, branded, or excommunicated. But none of that mattered, because the greater punishment was believed to come after death. Hell for a runaway monk was especially cruel, wandering forever, unable to find shelter, always hearing the bell that he refused to ring. And yet Benedict ran. The next week was rest. The monks kept glancing toward the horizon, hoping, fearing. Some imagined he had made it to a plague-free village. Others imagined him lying in a ditch, bloated, blackened, alone. Brother Lucian confessed that he dreamed of Benedict every night, standing on the edge of a burning field, calling them to follow. And then, 2 weeks later, he returned. Not through the gate, not through the main hall, but dragged by 2 men from the nearby village, wrapped in a blanket, barely conscious, eyes dull with fever. They said they'd found him wandering in the woods, coughing and bleeding from his gums. He kept asking for his cell, one man said he belonged behind stone. The monks took him back. They laid him in the infirmary, on a bed of straw, and prayed over him. Some refused to touch him, others sat vigil by his side. He murmured half-prayers, snatches of Latin. Sometimes he cried, sometimes he laughed. Once he whispered, "I thought the sky would be bluer." No one knew what he meant. He died on the 3rd day. No rite was given. The abbot refused it. He broke his vow, he said. Let that be enough. But Brother Marcus, who had once taught him his letters, crept into the infirmary that night, and placed a small cross in Benedict's hands. He was just a boy, he said, and he came back. They buried him outside the cloister wall, not in the cemetery, not among the brothers, but in the earth beneath the gate he had escaped through. A silent place. A cold place. Some monks visited it. Some never spoke of him again. But long after the plague had passed, a new novice, named Matthew, carved a message into the stone near Benedict's grave. It read, "He ran, he returned, he died with us. Let that be enough." Benedict's grave remained unmarked, unblessed, and unofficial, but it became a place of quiet pilgrimage. In the months that followed,
As winter swept over the abbey and the monks dwindled to less than a dozen, some still slipped out alone to stand beside the loose soil near the crumbling wall. They never stayed long. A prayer whispered, a stone placed, a glance toward the horizon, and back they went, cloaked in silence. The abbot never acknowledged it. He didn't need to. They all knew the boundaries of the rule had things that once would have been punished with fasting and flagellation were now met with tired glances and the soft rustle of robes. Inside the monastery, the talk of Benedict's escape took on new shapes. For the older monks it was a test, a reminder of obedience, of the vow of stability. He ran from his cross, Brother Pius once said, lips dry and cracked from fever. We must carry ours, no matter how heavy. But the younger novices, the few who remained, felt different. To them Benedict became something else. Not a rebel, not a heretic, not even a cautionary tale, but a kind of mirror. He had done what they all had thought about. When the moaning from the infirmary got louder, when the food was too thin to fill the bowl, when the pages of the Psalter blurred from sleeplessness, they imagined leaving too, running until the trees replaced the walls, until the chants faded behind them, but they didn't. Most because they were too sick, some because they were too afraid, and a few, perhaps the most tragic, because they still believed. The rule said to endure, and so they endured. Still, questions surfaced. Quietly, carefully, they asked if the outside world was still burning, if the fields were still barren, if the towns had emptied into silence like their own cloisters. Rumours filtered in from the occasional delivery man, few and far between now. One claimed the king had fled London, another said entire villages were empty, the church doors swinging open with no one left to kneel. And always the same refrain, no one is coming. So they stayed, and thought of Benedict. Brother Thomas, the youngest of the surviving novices, began to imitate him. He stood by the gate each evening after compline. Sometimes he whispered into the dark. No one knew what he said. Perhaps prayers, perhaps nothing. Perhaps he simply needed to feel that the world beyond still existed. One evening, Brother Silas followed him and asked gently, "What do you look for out there?" Thomas answered without turning, "A sky that isn't sick." It was a strange thing. The sky hadn't changed. Not truly. But it felt wrong. The stars no longer blinked with comfort. The moon rose like a wound, and during the day, clouds moved too slowly, casting long shadows across the cloister stones, as if time itself were dragging, and yet even then they kept to the rule. They prayed, they fasted, they swept the chapel, they chanted the psalms with voices like wind through reeds. They cared for the dying, even when they were too weak to lift them properly. The novitiate dormitory, once filled with hopeful chatter and whispered giggles after curfew, was now silent. Half the beds empty, the rest covered in thin, unmoving shapes. Benedict's story became their story, not because they all wanted to run, but because they all had to choose not to, again and again, every day, and the cost of that choice was not just physical, it was spiritual erosion. One novice, Brother Elias, confessed publicly that he hated the monastery, that he wished he had been braver, that Benedict had shown more courage than any of them. He died free, Elias said. We die caged. The abbot, weak and half-blind, simply nodded. Perhaps, he said, but we die with each other. That phrase echoed for days. We die with each other. It became a kind of comfort, a reassurance that their suffering wasn't wasted in isolation, that the act of staying, even in agony, even in futility, was its own kind of prayer. And then winter deepened. Frost crawled over the inner walls. Water froze in the bowls. Breath fogged the corridors. The fires were small now, just embers in iron pans, barely warming the air. No one went outside unless they had to. Benedict's grave was lost beneath a crust of snow. Only the newer novices remembered exactly where it lay. Brother Thomas tried to mark it with a stone. He slipped it through the hole in the wall one night. An old candle holder etched with He whispered Benedict's name once, then ran back inside, barefoot and shivering. Inside they sang the office in low voices. They read from cracked psalters with gloved hands, and between each word, each verse, each breath, they waited, for spring, for death, for anything else. Because the worst part of survival wasn't the pain, it was not knowing if it mattered, not knowing if the choice to stay had saved their souls or simply made their suffering longer. But still they stayed, and every once in a while someone would look at the gate, and remember.
Chapter 9. Leech, bleed and pray. In the absence of answers, they turned to old tools. The plague had swept through St. Albans, like fire, through dry thatch, and when prayer failed and the bells fell silent, the monks reached for what little they still had. Leeches, blades, herbs, vinegar, smoke, and scripture. Their bodies had been temples. Now they were experiments. They bled, they burned, they bathed in wine, and they begged.
They tried everything they could to survive, but they were monks, not physicians. And the line between healing and hurting blurred with every desperate hour. Brother Theodoric was the infirmarian. He had no real medical training, but he had inherited the role from his predecessor, along with a shelf of crumbling texts, some in Latin, some barely legible, and a small cabinet of herbs, ointments and crude tools. Before the plague, his duties had been manageable. He treated bruised knees, stomach pains, coughs from the cold. He mixed remedies of sage and honey. He recited prayers over fevers. He bandaged wounds and comforted the dying. But now the dying never stopped, and there was nothing left to comfort them with. When the plague began, he believed it was a punishment, then a test, then a storm, then a curse. Eventually he stopped trying to name it. All he could do was try to keep his brothers alive, and failing that, try to make their deaths less terrible. He turned first to bleeding. Bloodletting had long been a tradition among monks and physicians alike. It was thought that illness was caused by imbalance in the humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much blood meant fever, too much bile meant rage. The solution was simple: remove it. So Theodoric cut. He used sharpened brass needles and curved knives, opening veins in the arms, in the thighs, even behind the ears. The blood poured into clay bowls, onto straw mats, into the cracks of the stone floor. Some patients felt relief briefly. Most simply grew weaker. Brother Martin bled 3 times in 5 days. He said it cleared his mind. On the 6th day he collapsed while walking to the chapel, his face pale as parchment. "My mind is clear," he said before dying, "but my body is gone." Then came the leeches. Theodoric kept them in a wooden bucket, beside the infirmary window. They were fat and sluggish, often falling from the skin before they fed. He applied them to the feet, the spine, the groin. One monk insisted they be placed on his tongue, believing the plague had nested there. Theodoric refused, but he wrote the request down in his journal. He was beginning to suspect that insanity might be part of the disease. And then there were the fumigations. At night, he burned bundles of rosemary, sage and juniper in the infirmary. The monks choked on the smoke, their eyes watered, their throats closed. But it smelled cleaner than the rot of flesh. He tried vinegar baths, wine gargles, garlic poultices, placed over buboes. Nothing stopped the swellings, nothing stopped the coughing. When the herbs ran low, he boiled shoe leather in beer. When the wine ran out, he used rainwater mixed with ashes. One concoction included mustard seed, dried mint, onion, and a few drops of sanctified oil. It stained the skin but changed nothing. He began to experiment more. He applied heated iron to a monk's swollen neck, in hopes of driving out the poison. He covered a corpse with fresh herbs, then stripped them and placed them on a living monk, believing they might absorb the death. He drew crosses in blood on the walls of the infirmary. He painted a ring of ash around his own bed. None of it helped. But still, the monks submitted to his treatments. Because what else was there? When you live in a world ruled by ritual, even the illusion of action can feel like salvation. To bleed is to do something. To boil herbs is to hope. To suffer is to survive, if only for another hour. Brother Jerome, a stoic monk who rarely spoke, endured 12 treatments. He let Theodoric open his arms, apply leeches to his belly, rub garlic oil into his eyes. "I do not believe this will save me," he said, "but I believe you believe." That was the thread they clung to. Not truth, not evidence, but shared belief. The rule of Saint Benedict encouraged care for the sick. The sick were to be treated as Christ himself. But now there were too many. Theodoric stopped recording their names. He began counting by beds. Bed 3 worsens. Bed 5 is quiet. Bed 7 stinks of rot. He stopped praying aloud during treatment. He started talking to the tools instead, whispering to the knives, apologizing to the leeches, and the treatments grew stranger. He read aloud from the Gospels while opening a monk's thigh. He soaked pages of scripture in wine and placed them over plague sores. He stitched tiny crosses into the hem of his robe using thread made from the hair of a dead novice. His eyes darkened, his voice cracked. He stopped sleeping. Finally one night, he stood in the chapel and declared, "I have given blood, fire, herb and prayer. What more does God want?" No one answered. The next morning he was found collapsed in the herb room, surrounded by broken jars and wilted roots. He was alive, but only barely. Another monk took over his duties, though without his energy, without his conviction. The treatment slowed, the supplies dwindled. The infirmary became a place of waiting, not healing. But for a time they had tried, they had cut and bled and burned. And in that trying perhaps was the last fragile echo of hope. After Brother Theodoric collapsed, the infirmary went quiet, not in the peaceful way it once had, with whispered prayers and soft footfalls, but in the way of an abandoned battlefield. The walls still bore the stains of his efforts. Blood smears, burned herbs, cracked vials, and ash trails, but no one had the strength or will to clean them. Healing had ceased. The few remaining monks now came only to die. Brother Alban took over out of duty, not desire. He was no healer. He had once been a cook, gentle with spices, careful with temperature. Now he stirred bowls of vinegar and crushed garlic instead of barley and leek. If I must feed them, he said dryly, I'll feed them this. His sarcasm faded after the first two died under his care. The methods didn't change. Bleeding, leeching, compresses, a rotating script of desperation. One monk insisted they try burying him neck deep in dirt, something he'd heard from a traveling physician years earlier. The earth draws out poison, he gasped. Alban didn't argue. He and another monk dug a hole in the garden and sat him in it. The man died 3 hours later. They filled the hole in. There were no more leeches. They had all been used, squished or disappeared into the cellar shadows. There was barely any vinegar. The herbs had gone brittle. The last garlic clove was divided between two men. One swallowed the other rubbed it onto his feet and said, now at least I'll smell like supper. If there was any mercy left in the abbey, it was in the small pointless comforts that monks gave each other. A sip of warm water, a cool cloth on a fevered forehead, a whispered line from a side. The hands that once held blades now folded gently over a dying chest. The mouths that chanted matins now mumbled last rites, even if improperly, even if barely remembered. And yet, even in futility, some still clung to ritual. Brother Hadric continued marking the phases of illness with a charcoal tally on the infirmary wall. He noted fever, then swelling, then bleeding, then death. Some days he added 3 marks, some days only 1. Then he began adding symbols, crosses for those who received prayer, dots for those who did not, small circles for those who died silently. When he passed, another monk added a final X and closed the ledger. There was a shift in belief too. Not the complete abandonment of faith, but a kind of bending, a quiet reshaping. Monks who once believed healing was holy now began to see it as distraction. The body fails, Brother Pelagius said, coughing into a cloth. Only the soul matters now. He refused all treatment after that, and spent his last hours kneeling in the chapel until his legs gave out. But even those who clung to spirit felt it wearing thin. One evening, Brother Alban tried reading aloud from the Regula Medicinalis, an old Benedictine medical manual. His voice cracked halfway through a section on wine infusions. He stopped, stared at the page, then said, "This was written for a world that isn't here anymore." There was one final attempt at healing, one last act of hope wrapped in ritual. It came from Brother Marcus, a former herbalist, who had grown silent over the weeks. One day he emerged from the cellar holding a dried poppy bundle. "For sleep," he said, "for mercy." He crushed the pods, mixed them with what little wine remained, and offered it to the most afflicted. It dulled the pain, slowed the breath, loosened the hands clenched in agony. Some called it a miracle, others said it was a sin. Marcus only whispered, "Let them go gently." From then on, the poppy wine was called the final draught. It was given without ceremony. A cloth was soaked, lips were moistened. Sleep followed. The monks stopped asking if it helped the soul. They only knew it softened the end. And still Brother Alban kept bleeding those who begged for it. Out of habit, out of fear, because to say no felt like surrender. Even when the knife slipped, even when the patient moaned, even when blood pooled uselessly on the floor, he carried on. He stopped only after cutting his own palm while sterilizing a blade. He stared at the gash, at the blood dripping onto his sandal, and muttered, "Now I'm part of the cure." He died 4 days later. The infirmary was left unstaffed after that. The few monks who remained avoided it unless they had no other place to lie down. Some curled up in the refectory, others simply stayed in their cells, listening to their breath slow. The walls of the sick room were left scrawled with messages, prayers, names, nonsense phrases. One read, "This is not penance, this is fire." Outside, the last herbs wilted in the cold. No more poultices, no more tinctures. The monastery had returned to silence, and pain became a private thing. Only one treatment remained, prayer. Not as a cure but as an echo of who they had been. Monks who once studied anatomy, now traced crosses in the air. Those who had once mixed infusions, now whispered invocation. Even the feeble, the fevered, the ones whose minds had slipped. They still moved their lips, because in the end there was nothing left to bleed, nothing left to burn, nothing left to give. Only voices, only faith, only the dying speaking into the dark.
Chapter 10. Death in the Scriptorium. By winter's arrival, the scriptorium at St. Albans was no longer a place of learning or prayer. It was a tomb of frozen ink, slumped bodies, and half-written verses. Once the pride of the monastery, it had become a quiet chamber of final acts. Death had already taken the refectory, the dormitories, the infirmary. Now it came for the books. It didn't happen all at once. At first, a few monks still tried to write, even when the library had been purged, even when ink was running low and parchment too brittle. They found scraps, fragments of old folios, pieces of boiled vellum, even margins from discarded hymnals. They wrote on anything. They wrote because it was what they had always done. The scriptorium, despite everything, had light. It faced east, with tall windows that allowed the morning sun to warm the long wooden desks. The stone was cold, but familiar. The smell of wax and dust lingered. It was one of the few rooms in the abbey that hadn't yet surrendered to rot. Brother Ambrose had been a scribe for most of his life. His hands were crooked now, bones swollen from age and cold, but he still held a quill like it was part of him. After surviving a fever in early autumn, he returned to the scriptorium every morning, wrapped in blankets, a candle lit beside him. He wasn't copying scripture anymore. He was writing a chronicle, not for the church, not for posterity, but for whoever came next, if anyone did. The first line of his work was simple: "We are dying, and we do not know why." Others joined him for a while. Brother Parnell copied psalms, leaving blank spaces for the names of the dead. Brother Johann wrote prayers for forgiveness that he whispered aloud as he inked each word. A novice, one of the last, wrote a single sentence over and over on the back of an old missal: "Deliver us, Lord." But they began to fall, one by one. Brother Parnell was the first. He had been working on Psalm 51, "Have mercy on me, O God," when his hand seized mid-letter. The word transgressions remained half-formed. His head hit the desk with a soft sound, and he was gone. Ambrose closed his eyes, kissed his forehead, and covered the body with a tattered cloak. They didn't stop writing. Brother Johann died the next week. He had been compiling a litany of saints, names scrawled in descending lines down the page. The ink blurred near the bottom. His hands had started to tremble, and then the quill dropped. He died sitting up, eyes on the window. The novice died in silence. No one noticed for hours. Ambrose made a small note in the margin of his chronicle beside their names. Fell in labour, like harvesters or soldiers. It was his way of honouring them. Let's pause here and remember what the scriptorium was. It had once been the heart of the monastery's purpose: preservation. Monks copied not just scripture, but medicine, astronomy, philosophy, history. They were the keepers of memory. In a world of oral tradition and decay, they were anchors of continuity. Their pages were meant to last longer than stone, but now, even the words were dying. With so few left, the temperature dropped sharply. The ink froze in its pot. Ambrose began holding his inkwell beneath a candle before each line. He cut quills with trembling fingers. He wrapped his feet in old scraps of parchment, but still he came, each day, to record. One morning he wrote, "The silence is heavier than the snow." Another day, "I heard no voices in the chapel. I went to ring the bell but could not lift the rope." His entries grew shorter, more fragmented. One page simply read, "3 more gone." Another had only a date, with no words beside it. Then finally, "I may be the That line was written shakily, ink blotted, the parchment smudged. A later hand, different, younger, stronger, would add a note at the bottom of that page. He was not. That's how we know Brother Ulrich was still alive. Ulrich was not a scribe. He had once tended the stables, but when he found Ambrose slumped in the scriptorium, hand frozen around the last quill, he wept, not because Ambrose had died, but because he had not finished the sentence. He buried him with a psalter, then he picked up the quill. And for 2 more weeks, Ulrich wrote, not neatly, not beautifully, but with fierce resolve. He recopied Ambrose's final pages. He added names. He drew maps of the monastery. He listed everything that had been burned, everything that had been saved. And finally he wrote, "If you find this, know we remembered, know we stayed, know we tried." He folded the parchment, wrapped it in cloth, sealed it in wax, and placed it in the mouth of the old reliquary, beneath the altar. No one knows what became of Ulrich. But centuries later, that bundle was found, dry and intact, its ink faded, but legible. Alongside it, the edge of a robe, a rusted bell fragment, a single word carved into the reliquary stone: Witness. The scriptorium's last winter was marked, not by pages turned, but by pages forgotten, curled at the edges, scattered like dry leaves, silent, where they once chanted. After Brother Ambrose's final entry, and Brother Ulrich's quiet assumption of duty,
the scriptorium faded further into a space of quiet resistance. It was no longer about preserving knowledge for the ages. It had become an act of spiritual defiance. To write anything, names, dates, fragments of prayers, was to say, we still exist. Brother Ulrich wasn't a man of words. Before the plague he'd fed the horses, shoveled manure and polished the harness buckles. He had strong hands and a limp from an old break in his right leg. But after so many had died, including Ambrose, whose body he buried with a psalter and a handful of candle stubs, Ulrich did what he thought a monk should do. He kept the story going. His writing was crude, large letters, uneven spacing, often misspelled Latin, but it was earnest. He copied what he could understand. He made lists. He wrote about the weather, who was still breathing, who had grown quiet, and in between he added thoughts that had nowhere else to live. The crows do not leave, he wrote one morning. They must think we still have something to offer. He began naming the days, not by feast or saint, but by small personal markers. The day the wind broke the glass in the refectory, the day I spoke to no one, the day the last candle burned out, and I sat in the dark, writing with a shaking hand. Each entry was a kind of funeral. Every time he picked up the quill he mourned again, not just people but the old world, a world where the script was beautiful, where meals were hot, where prayers echoed in group, where the pages he now stained had once been pressed flat and gold-leafed by hands long buried. One page reads, "The ink grows thin, I add wine to stretch it. The color is wrong but I continue." Another, "I tried to light a fire in the scriptorium. Smoke filled the room. I could not breathe. I left the cold in place." Ulrich's most haunting entry is just 3 lines. "No one came to Vespers. I said the prayers anyway, out loud, loud enough for God to hear." We cannot say exactly how long he survived. His last dated entry is in late February. After that, the pages go blank for several days. Then one final edition, written in a steadier, smaller hand. This scribe is unknown, perhaps a pilgrim, perhaps one of the first to return to the abbey after the plague had loosened its grip. This person wrote, "I found the scriptorium empty, books untouched, candles melted to stone, a single body, seated upright, hands frozen over a page that read, 'We endured.'" They buried Ulrich outside the chapel wall. And they did something unusual. They placed the page he had been writing inside a wooden case, and mounted it on the wall of the scriptorium, not for public display. No pilgrims would come for years, but as a gesture, a memory of a man who wasn't meant to be a scribe, but who became one because there was no one else. We know about him because that page survived. Alongside it, a smaller parchment had been folded and tucked into a broken inkwell. It held only 6 words. Ink ends, voice ends, God remains. What's extraordinary is that, even as death crept into every room of the abbey, the act of writing never entirely stopped. It changed, it lost precision, it lost purpose, but it didn't vanish. Fragments recovered centuries later revealed curious shifts in tone. One novice began composing a psalm of his own, half prayer, half cry. It begins as a plea, "O Lord, who watched while we fell." But then it falters, "Did you turn your face? Did you hold your breath while we drowned in the dark?" It ends not in hope, but in silence, unfinished, midline, as if the quill slipped from dying fingers, and maybe it did. Because death in the scriptorium wasn't theatrical, it was quiet, the kind that came between words, the kind that left ink trails ending in smudges, the kind that made a man look up from the page and never look down again. There's something almost unbearably human in those last texts, not the theology, not the order, but the rawness, the scratching, the stubbornness. These were men collapsing in their chairs, yet still pressing quill to parchment, still leaving behind proof that they had once existed, thought, wept, tried. One final note found decades later, written in cramped, near-illegible script on the back of a reused psalter page reads, "If all else fades, let someone find these words and say they were here, and now, we have."
They came not for glory, not for conquest, but for quiet, for prayer, for a life spent in service, sealed behind stone and scripture. The monks of St. Albans did not expect fame. Their names were meant to be known only to God, their deeds whispered in candlelight, their deaths wrapped in psalms, and yet, centuries later, we remember them, not because they triumphed, but because they endured, through fevered nights and silent mornings, through burnt books and broken vows. They kept a rhythm. When bells no longer rang, they rang them in memory. When the pages stopped turning, they still wrote in margins. When no one remained to listen, they spoke aloud anyway, into the air, into the stone, into the silence. because that is what faith looks like when it's all that remains. They did not win, but they did not vanish. Their footprints are etched in soot, their voices pressed in ink, their prayers buried in earth. In the end, they gave us more than survival. They gave us witness, a record of grief and courage, a reminder that even in history's darkest hour, someone kept the flame alive. So tonight, as the world sleeps and our own silence deepens, let us remember them, not as martyrs, not as saints, but as men, men who stayed, men who wrote, men who died with the Psalms on their lips and the plague at their door. This has been the Drowsy Historian. May your rest be peaceful, and may your dreams be full of stories that remember what the world once forgot.